item of business. The clerk is going to read what the next item of business is.
I'm so sorry. Economic Activity of Public Bodies Overseas Matters Bill, third reading.
No.
King's consent? Thank you very much. I must inform the House that the reason amendment in the name of Keir Starmer has been selected. I call the Minister to move third reading.
Thank you very much, Mr Deputy Speaker, and I'm grateful to you for the opportunity to move the third reading of this bill today. As the House will know, this bill was introduced before the King's speech in the last parliamentary session. It is a carryover bill, and I wanted to begin by thanking all those who took part in the second reading, in the committee stage and in the report stage of consideration of this bill. Inevitably, following on from the bill's introduction, debate around the bill has occurred in the dark shadow of the events of October the 7th and the continuing conflict in Israel and Gaza. And that's why I wanted to stress, as I sought to at report stage, my gratitude to the thoughtful way in which every member of this House has contributed to debate on this bill. And while there is, I know, a difference of opinion about the appropriateness of the measures that we're bringing forward, everyone in this House is committed to ensuring that we act against anti-Semitism. Everyone in this House is committed to ensuring that we can see a peaceful solution to the conflict in the Middle East, and everyone in this House is committed to a two-state solution as the means by which we can bring peace to that troubled region. The bill, of course, upholds a principle that was originally outlined in our 2019 general election manifesto, and during the course of consideration of the bill, we've heard from a number of organisations, both at committee stage and in broader public debate about the bill, all affirming its timeliness and importance in dealing with the continuing and indeed growing threat of anti-Semitism, and also upholding the importance of making sure that the UK government speaks with one voice, in a united way, on behalf of all of us, on foreign policy as a reserved matter for the government. And I think it's important, of course, in that context, to deal with one or two, again, of entirely understandable and legitimate concerns that have been raised about the interplay between the bill itself and UK government foreign policy. And I know that some particular concerns have been raised about Clause 3.7. And I do want to assure colleagues that this clause does not contravene in any way our foreign policy and does not in any way inhibit the UK government from taking action if we believe that there is activity in the occupied Palestinian territories that requires to be called out by this government. And we continue to raise, as the Foreign Secretary has recently, issues of illegal settler activity, and Lord Cameron has been clear with the Israeli government that the UK government is in profound disagreement with some of those actions and some of that activity. And I'll come on to that in just a second. I should say that the clause doesn't prevent the government establishing sanctions or using travel bans against those who have been linked to blatant human rights abuses. It is simply the aim of this legislation to prevent public bodies adopting their own foreign policy, as such decisions should ultimately be the remit of the government and this House. And I know, given the nature of the debate on this, that a number of colleagues would like to intervene. I'll try and answer questions briefly because I know that a number of colleagues would also like to take part in the debate.
Thank you, Mr. O.C., and thank you to the Secretary of State. It's not always helpful to have hypotheticals, but I beg his indulgence in this hypothetical on that particular point about the interaction between 3.7 and UK foreign policy. UK foreign policy is clear that illegal Israeli settlements in the occupied territories are illegal against international law. This bill would provide that if a pension fund was provided with an investment policy for expanding, let's say, an infrastructure fund proposal in the occupied territories, that they would have no moral basis to refuse investment in that, and that investment would be expanding Israeli policies contrary to UK foreign policy. Can the Secretary of State explain to me how I unpack that so what he's just said is actually what I believe is true?
It is specifically the case that public bodies, including the local government pension scheme and local authorities, should not be taking decisions which conflict with UK government foreign policy, and we are absolutely clear that it would conflict with UK government foreign policy if they were to engage in freelance activity of that kind. But it is perfectly open to any representative, including any elected representative, to express their personal disapproval of the activities either of the Israeli government or the activities of any organisation that operates within the settlements. And of course, I'm happy to give way to the honourable gentleman.
Secretary of State giving way on that point. I've been listening very carefully to what he said on this point. But the government earlier this year stated, and I quote, that the UK has a clear position on Israeli settlements in the occupied Palestinian territories. They are illegal under international law. So, to speak plainly, isn't the Secretary of State actually ashamed that his government, through this clampdown on the democratic right to boycott, is actually restricting the rights of those who want to take peaceful action against violations of international law, in effect siding with those breaking international law?
Again, with respect to the honourable gentleman who's taken a close personal interest in the conflict, and I do appreciate the sincerity with which he raises it, absolutely not. There is a clear intention in this bill, which is to deal specifically with the BDS campaign, and the BDS's campaign's attempt to use local government and other intermediate institutions and their legitimacy to undermine the UK government's foreign policy. The UK government, whichever colour of government it is, must speak with one voice on behalf of the whole United Kingdom when it comes to foreign policy matters. And as I'm sure the honourable gentleman will agree, from this dispatch box, my right honourable friend, the member for Sutton Coldfield, and in another place, the Foreign Secretary, have been clear with the Israeli government when they think it is appropriate to criticise the actions of the government and indeed the actions of individuals operating within those settlements. But there is a distinction, and an important distinction, to be drawn between criticism of the Israeli government, criticism of the acts of particular individuals, and the nature of the BDS campaign itself. And I'm grateful to the opposition front bench, while we have our disagreements, and to Labour Friends of Israel, for making clear that the BDS movement itself is explicitly and regrettably anti-Semitic. Because the BDS movement deliberately sets out to argue that the State of Israel as a home for the Jewish people should not exist. Happy to give way.
Thank you, Secretary of State, for giving way, and I agree with the comments he's just made. It is the case that Israel is pretty much the only country that is targeted in this way, despite the fact there are a number of appalling regimes around the world. And does the Secretary of State also agree with me that when it comes to local authorities, a lot of these councillors, instead of virtual signalling and clumsily wading into complex international issues, they should focus on their core job, which is to run local services?
And not for the first time, I entirely agree with my honourable friend, and two very important. I mean, he summed up in that intervention two of the critical points in this bill. Firstly, local government has many important functions. Intervening in foreign policy in a way which can exacerbate community tensions is emphatically not one of them. And secondly, there has been a unique focus on the State of Israel. Of course, there are criticisms that can and should be mounted of the State of Israel, its government, and their activities. However, the BDS campaign singles out Israel for special treatment. We have not seen attempts by local government to criticise, for example, the actions of Bashar Assad in Syria or a variety of other regimes that have been targeting innocent Muslim lives. And again, one of the points that has been made very clearly by the former, now sadly departed Chief Rabbi Lord Sachs, is that anti-Semitism is a virus that mutates over time. In the past, anti-Semitism was directed towards Judaism as a faith. Then it mutated to be directed towards the Jewish people through direct racism. Now anti-Semitism finds an expression through an attempt to deny the Jewish people the same right of self-determination and the same right to a homeland that we extend to all peoples. And I just wanted to add one final point before giving way, which is that the support for this bill from Jewish organisations in this country has been clear. The Jewish Leadership Council, the Board of Deputies for British Jews, and so on. But perhaps the most telling is the words of the Community Security Trust, which is there to physically protect Jewish people and Jewish communities. The Community Security Trust is scrupulous in not offering any commentary on matters in Israel or foreign policy or the Middle East. It eschews that because it recognises there's a diversity of views within the Jewish community on some of these questions. But the CST has said that BDS has a chilling impact on Jews. It's a modern reminder of anti-Jewish boycotts. it also serves to legitimise the shunning of Jews from, quotes, decent society. And having been shunned, they go on to say, that is a halfway house to all manner of more abusive and physical outcomes. And when we've seen an increase in anti-Semitic incidents of 537%, then I think it's important to bear those words in mind. And I'm very happy to give way.
Very grateful to Moran for giving way, and he's making some extremely important points about the nature of the BDS movement. And isn't it the case that, as he says, there's been very, very few examples of councils looking to use levers available for them to protest against other international issues? And isn't that because the whole BDS movement, in fact, the label BDS, has been entirely constructed as a weapon against the State of Israel? And when you look at the origins of the movement, unfortunately, it is riddled from top to bottom with anti-Semitism.
I'm afraid that my right honourable friend is absolutely correct. And again, to be fair, more than fair, there are many prominent Labour voices who have made precisely that point, and that the BDS campaign, those who created it, those who run it, are very, very clear. They are singling out Israel. They want to see an end to Israel as a Jewish state. I'm very conscious of the fact that there are a number of honourable and right honourable members who wish to contribute. I also, again, want to emphasise that a horror towards and a revulsion towards anti-Semitism and prejudice of all kinds is shared across this House, as is a determination to see peace in the Middle East. I believe, and we've rehearsed the arguments, I think, with great contributions at committee stage and at report stage, that this bill is a targeted and proportionate approach to dealing with a unique evil, and I hope that tonight we will be able to support this bill. But as I say, dissenting voices in this House must always be heard with respect, and with that, I beg to move.
The question is that the bill be now read the third time. As everybody knows, this debate will come to a conclusion at 6:45. There are a number of people trying to catch my eye, so I really should be thinking not much longer than 3 minutes, to be frank, depending on the contributions of the front benches. And I now call Angela Rayner to move the amendment.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. And let me start by making clear that the Labour Party completely opposes a policy of boycott, divestment and sanctions against Israel. It is in everyone's interest that we find a way forward to address a genuine problem. And never has this been so important as now. At a time of heightened tensions, fear and distress, both home and abroad, and so throughout the passage of this bill, we have always tried to seek consensus. We don't think that it's wrong for public bodies to take ethical investment and procurement decisions. In fact, there is a long tradition of councils and other bodies taking stances on such questions. But there is a difference between applying consistent ethical principles and legitimate criticism of foreign governments. And what some have tried to do by targeting just one individual state, for example, the world's only Jewish state, or worse, to use the cover of these issues to whip up prejudice or discrimination. This is completely wrong. And for the Labour Party, that will never change. And on these fundamental principles, I thank the Secretary of State for acknowledging that we share common ground. And Mr Deputy Speaker, it is on this basis that I have hoped by now that we would have had a bill that reflects that common ground. But unfortunately, our efforts for consensus have been met with blanket refusal. 4 times we came to this House with an alternative approach, but 4 times ministers have led the benches opposite into voting down every single one of these proposals and sought not to unite the House, but to divide it in every sense. We did not want to be in this position where the House is being told to approve such deeply flawed piece of legislation. But, Mr Deputy Speaker, this is where we have regrettably ended up, because the bill before us today is indeed deeply flawed, with sweeping new powers that create more uncertainty and run counter to their international obligations, provisions which would ban public bodies from making procurement decisions based on a country's use of forced labour, a clause completely unprecedented which makes it illegal for public bodies, many of them directly elected, to express their view on policy. a new power for the Secretary of State himself to call in and interrogate those he suspects fall foul of the bill. And at its heart, a measure that is incompatible with both the government's own long-standing foreign policy and international law, flying in the face of the UK obligations. It's why I respectively dispute what the Secretary of State said in his opening remarks. Explicitly equating Israel with the occupied Palestinian territories in the Golan Heights is an unprecedented step. To my knowledge, this wording has never appeared in the British statute before, and it seriously undermines our country's long-standing, consistent and cross-party support for a two-state solution. So, Mr. Deputy Speaker, I could not be more disappointed. There are moments when all sides of this House come together to resolve deep-seated issues facing our communities. This could have been one of them. But instead, the government have refused to listen. And so, as this bill is read a third time, we have had to put forward a reasoned amendment as a final plea for the Secretary of State to reconsider. We all know that this is a highly unusual procedure, so I wanted to make it clear why we have deemed it necessary. We recognise there is a problem to solve, and we want to solve it too. But if this bill means a protracted legal battle in the courts, creates more uncertainty than it addresses, or worse, simply fuels yet more division, it will have achieved nothing. And it could in fact make matters worse. I have no doubt that this will be scrutinised and challenged if sent to our colleagues in the other place, and I can only hope that we find further opportunities to forge a consensus. But the bill before the House today is simply not fit to send them. The greatest shame is that in this challenging time, we had the chance to speak with one voice against discrimination and division, for unity at home and for lasting peace abroad. And it is in that spirit that I urge the whole House to support our amendment today.
The original question was that the bill be now read a third time. Since when an amendment has been proposed as on the order paper, the question is that the amendment be made. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Well, let's start with 4 minutes then. Kit Malthouse.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Again, as I said at second reading and at report stage, I speak with a heavy heart and some dismay and tell the front bench that I will be voting against the bill this evening. This bill obviously comes at a dreadful time as we mourn the deaths of so many Israelis in heinous circumstances on October the 7th and the deaths of so many Palestinians subsequently, many of whom still lie under the rubble. The fact that we would, in this House, be seeking to legislate against non-violent protest in such an illiberal and draconian way seems to me tragic at this particular point in time. There are broadly 3 areas, as the Secretary of State knows, where I and other colleagues attempted to amend the bill and where we have concerns. The first is, as the Shadow Secretary of State pointed out, the conflation, the separate identification within the bill of Israel, its conflation with the occupied territories and the Golan Heights, we do believe contravenes our undertakings at the United Nations and indeed international law, and that, of course, we think will mean that the bill spends a lot of time in the courts if it eventually sees the light of day. That also, at the same time, is a cause of great dismay to our allies in the Arab world, who, of course, we need at the moment more than ever to join us in seeking peace in this dreadful conflict that's taking place in the Middle East, and that we should undermine our own status as fair dealers, if you like, in that part of the world seems to me an unforced error. The second area of serious concern is obviously the impact on free speech. Again, as the opposition front bench has pointed out, it seems to me incredible that we are putting elected officials and others in a position where if they just stand up in certain circumstances and say they disagree with the law, they will be committing a criminal act. It seems to me an incredibly illiberal and backward step that we would strike a blow against pluralism in that way. The bill could stand without those restrictions on free speech, and as the Secretary of State will know, we attempted to amend it to remove them as well. That was also rebuffed. The third area is the sheer scale of the impact of this bill and the number of organisations that are going to be drawn into it. So not just the local government pension fund, of which I am a member, but also every university in the land, private sector companies who perform a public service of some kind, who are contractors to the government, will also be drawn in. And this is important because, as the Secretary of State will know, this area is a very litigious one. There are lawyers sympathetic to Israel and those sympathetic to Palestine. And it seems, from the Secretary of State's statement, that this bill is aimed squarely at that particular conflict in this world. There are lawyers on both sides who will gear up. An industry will arise to attack, defend, analyse, scrutinise every decision that is taken. And all these bodies will have to take significant internal legal advice to deal with it as well. And so subjecting all of them to this enormous burden seems to be disproportionate to the problem that they're trying to impact. But then finally, Mr. Speaker, my greatest concern is for the impact on British Jewry. As the Secretary of State has said, he's trying to bring this bill in to, I guess, deal with the growth in anti-Semitism in the United Kingdom. But my view is that this bill will play entirely into the hands of the anti-Semites. I would imagine that those social media groups and WhatsApp groups, these rotten groups that espouse conspiracy theories about Israel and about the Jewish community, this will be manna to them. They will see this as Jonathan Friedman...
Sorry, order. No time limit. Chris Stevens.
Thank you very much, Mr Deputy Speaker. It's a real pleasure to follow the Right Honourable Gentleman for North West Hampshire, and I hope that other members of the House have listened to his contribution and what he's had to say, because I too share his concerns about the deviation of and using domestic legislation in this bill to deviate away from Foreign Office policy. And that is the clear concern that many of us had, in particular at committee stage, and an exchange with the Honourable Member for Caerphilly when we were exploring this matter. We were talking about what the actual foreign policy is, because the bill, I believe, as it's currently constructed, is a clear conflation with Israel, the occupied Palestinian territories and the Golan Heights. And yet, the UK Government's guidance on overseas business risk states the UK has a clear position on Israeli settlements. The West Bank, including East Jerusalem, Gaza and the Golan Heights, have been occupied by Israel since 1967. Settlements are illegal under international law, constitute an obstacle to peace and threaten a two-state solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The concerns that we have is that it's less than subtle as a change. If not in direct policy, then certainly on emphasis. Equating Israel and the occupied territories is unique in any legislation, let alone in a statement, and questions the long-established position that the UK has cross-party in supporting a two-state solution based on 1967 borders. Also, Mr Deputy Speaker, the bill is, I believe, and we as a party believe, an assault on the devolution settlement for Westminster, not just of the Scottish Parliament, but the Welsh Senate. The legislation undermines devolution and restricts the ability for public bodies to make their own moral judgment in matters of human rights and climate consciousness. Now, I heard the Secretary of State argue that public bodies should not deviate away from foreign policy. But as we've discovered in this debate and in all the debates that we've had, that Glasgow District Council in 1981, a Labour-led local authority, gave Nelson Mandela the freedom of the city of Glasgow. It also encouraged boycotting of South African goods and services. But the Foreign Office policy at the time was not to support sanctions of the apartheid South African regime. And so the question again is, could Glasgow District Council in 1981 have awarded Nelson Mandela the freedom of the city of Glasgow, and would Glasgow District Council have been allowed to encourage the boycott of South African goods and services, because if this bill had been in place then I think the answer to that question is that it could not. And I'll give way to my honourable friend.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way. He's doing a great job at putting on record our opposition to this foul piece of legislation. But can I ask him, does he not think there is something particularly distasteful and grotesque that this is coming at this time, and that the only legislative response by the UK government to what is happening in the Middle East is to try and bring forward proposals to stifle criticism of Israel, when it is clear and there is so much evidence that Israel is facing charges of breaching international law and breaching the Geneva Convention? Surely most right-minded people in this country who believe in decency and fairness will think this is the wrong thing at the wrong time.
I thank my honourable friend for that. I think that we all have a concern that at this moment in time, whether it was appropriate to proceed with this bill, I think is a concern that many members have, and I'm sure that there will be other members who may wish to state that in when they get their opportunity to speak, Mr Deputy Speaker. The bill extends to devolved governments and local authorities in the devolved nations because procurement and investment by public bodies aren't reserved matters, and this would appear to breach the Surrey Convention if the devolved legislators don't agree. And I note, Mr Deputy Speaker, that the Scottish Parliament has not provided legislative consent to this particular bill. We also have concerns, Mr Deputy Speaker, that public bodies will not be able to make decisions around environmental protections. Friends of the Earth, for example, have said that the bill would prevent public bodies from divesting from fossil fuel, as well as diverting their money away from inadvertently funding human rights abuses abroad, such as modern slavery in the corporate supply chains. They would not be allowed to consider labour rights, for example, from China to Colombia, Bangladesh to Angola, Cambodia to Qatar, and Mexico to Romania. Poor workers' rights are not restricted to any one region of the world. According to the World Economic Forum, abuse of workers' rights around the world reached a record high in 2022. And I believe that public bodies, when making their funding arrangements and procurement and anything else, should be allowed to consider labour rights. And our concern is that the bill does not allow that to happen. I want to make it clear on behalf of the Scottish National Party, as I have at every stage of the bill, is that we are concerned that anti-Semitism is on the rise around the world, and we must not look away, and we must call it out whenever we see it. Anti-Semitism is a truly global and iniquitous poison. The bill does not address the very epidemic, that is, of rising anti-Semitism, that it claims it wants to tackle. Mr Deputy Speaker, we're also concerned that the Government have ignored the evidence that many organisations have put forward with their concerns from this bill. The Balfour Project, the trade union Unison, of which I am proud to be a member, the Union of Jewish Students, Jews for Justice for Palestinians, who've all provided very good evidence of their concerns for the bill, and I'm afraid that those have not been taken on board by the Government when we've considered these matters. They've also rejected sensible amendments, Mr Deputy Speaker, those of us who have real concerns about Clause 3. Those of us who have very real concerns about Clause 4. I never thought I'd ever say it, but I have to say it again, that I'm seeking removal of Clause 4. Amendments to protect devolution and other public bodies, and amendments to ensure compatibility with human rights. So, in conclusion, Mr Deputy Speaker, the changing of foreign policy, impinging on the rights of devolved institutions and other public bodies, ignoring the evidence, rejecting sensible amendments, these are the key reasons why this bill does not deserve a third reading.
Limit till the end of the debate. Theresa Villiers.
I support this bill, and I urge others to do so as well. But I also want to emphasise that I very much respect the views of those who have practical concerns about how it will operate in practice, and I know that all members of this House, whatever their views on this bill, remain committed to a peaceful settlement and a negotiated two-state solution. Mr Deputy Speaker, I've just returned from a visit to Israel, which will appear on the next publication of the Register of Interest. And I believe strongly that we should be backing Israel, not boycotting it. It is hard. It has had to take military action to defend itself from a vile and repulsive terrorist attack in which over 1,000 lost their lives. Last week, I visited an exhibition in Tel Aviv about the Nova Music Festival, where hundreds of young people were gunned down. The displays there of shoes and clothes and bags were chillingly reminiscent of Yad Vashem and the piles of belongings taken from Jewish people on arrival at the death camps. And we can be in no doubt that the BDS movement is divisive and it is damaging. It rejects a two-state solution and it consistently opposes efforts to bring Israelis and Palestinians together. As the government has stated again this evening, BDS activities drive anti-Semitism. I'm especially concerned about the impact of Israel boycotts on campus, where anti-Israel hatred so often morphs into racist treatment of Jewish students. It is entirely unacceptable for Jewish students to feel unable to be open about their faith or their identity for fear of reprisals and harassment. Furthermore, Mr. Deputy Speaker, foreign policy is the responsibility of government. It is and always has been a reserved power. There is no need and no justification for universities or local authorities or other public bodies to run their own foreign policy. If sanctions or boycotts need to be imposed, that is a decision to be made in this House at a national level. So in conclusion, Mr. Deputy Speaker, this is an important bill at a very difficult time, tackling a very serious problem. I commend it to the House and I hope my colleagues will back it.
Thank you very much. Layla Moran.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker, and it's with a heavy heart again that I'm participating in the debate today. Throughout December, alongside the Pope and the Archbishop of Canterbury, I sought to shed light on the suffering of Christians in Gaza City, which include my own family. And may I express sincere gratitude for members across the House who have approached me in the last few days to ask how they are. While the media attention did mitigate the immediate dangers, the plight of Gaza's residents persists, living hand to mouth, drinking unclean water, and wondering how on earth the world is letting this happen. But I am equally concerned on the impact it is having on the streets in the UK. We are seeing a rise of anti-Semitism and anti-Muslim hate, and it is unacceptable and must be called out. Absolutely.
Would my honourable friend
yes.
I'm very grateful, and I too extend my sympathies to her experiences and the experiences of her family. And as many of the cases, my own council, Cyngor Gwynedd, has called for an immediate ceasefire last month, echoing the people's concerns. They condemn both Hamas violence and Israel's disproportionate attacks on civilians. The Senedd has also called for a ceasefire. This bill will restrict members of Welsh democratic institutions from voicing their views, and I'm sure she agrees with me that this restriction on free speech is something that is a threat to our democracy across the nations of the United Kingdom.
I thank her for intervention. I absolutely agree. I think this does not respect the directly elected bodies and those representatives. And it's the timing, it's not just that, but it's also the timing of this. We have a death toll in Gaza that now exceeds 22,000, and over 100 Israeli hostages are remaining. And I don't put those numbers side by side to compare, because every single individual lost or missing is a tragedy in its own name. And the humanitarian situation has reached new depths. A doctor, constituent of mine who is working in Gaza, said that he's seen preventable deaths due to staff shortages, and the medical system has totally collapsed. We now have injured with nowhere to go. And tomorrow, the International Court of Justice will consider South Africa's case on Israel's alleged violations and obligations under the Genocide Convention. I am sure I need not remind this House that it was precisely local government-led interventions here in the UK, interventions that would be outlawed under this bill, that pressured the Thatcher government to add their voice to support the people of South Africa. The Foreign Secretary yesterday said that he didn't agree with the ICJ case, And I quote, "I don't think we should be bandying around terms like genocide." But, Mr. Deputy Speaker, South Africa is not bandying around terms. The ICJ is precisely the court in which those allegations should be looked at. And the principle is simple. The UK shouldn't prejudge the outcome of the legal case. It should be backing the process and the court itself full-throatedly. So I end by simply saying the Liberal Democrats will continue to advocate for an immediate bilateral ceasefire, securing hostage release, delivering aid, and working towards that precious two-state solution. Our response to this war will be judged by history, and in a fractured world where democracies need to be strengthened and the international rules-based order helped, this bill undermines local government, damages our global standing, and divides our streets. This place should be a place where we unite people, not divide, and the Liberal Democrats believe that this debate, frankly, shouldn't be happening. We stand with humanity and peace, and it is for that reason that we will be voting against the bill today.
Thank you. Sir Michael Ellis.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. The Government's introduction of this bill is welcome and I support it. And it was a Conservative Party manifesto years ago, and we have a mandate and an obligation to pass it. And this piece of legislation will finally stop public bodies from wrongfully pursuing their own independent foreign policy agenda, which, by the way, have almost exclusively been a result of divisive, anti-Semitic partisan campaigns pursued by the anti-Semitic BDS movement. And, of course, that is a movement, as has already been mentioned, whose executive board, the BNC, is a coalition of proscribed terrorist groups, including Hamas. So I support this bill. The boycott movement has undeniably succeeded, sadly, up to this point, in its chilling and racist effects. Who can forget in 2011 the loathsome policy of, which frankly was reminiscent of 20th century fascism, of West Dunbartonshire Council, when its libraries banned new book volumes printed or published in the Jewish state. Yes, they banned Jewish books. Allied Universal, a parent company of G4S, sold a business in Israel following pressure from the movement. A series of councils across England, Scotland and Wales, including Leicester City, Swansea City and Gwynedd councils, motions were passed banning imports from Israel. These are inherently discriminatory and, by the way, Mr. Deputy Speaker, a breach of our WTO obligations. So those councils are an embarrassment to this country and they should have been ashamed of their racism. And of course the supreme irony is, and this is the supreme irony, that Palestinian and Israeli businesses in the region and leaders of those businesses condemn this movement. If anyone takes the trouble to listen to those leaders, instead they are seeking bilateralism. Nearly 100,000 Palestinians are actually employed by Israeli companies. The workforce there receives higher wages, they enjoy greater protections than elsewhere in the Palestinian economy and its equivalents across the Middle East. So, regrettably, the BDS movement strengthens extremists and it weakens moderates, which is why it has even opposed peaceful coexistence projects bringing Israelis and Palestinians together, such as Heartbeat and One Voice. So, speaking as a former Attorney General, I can assure the House that this ban will not apply to individuals or private organisations where they are not carrying out public functions, and that's testimony to this government's respect for freedom of speech. But it is wholly... I will give way, yeah.
I'm very grateful, Tim. He's confirmed that this bill will not apply to individuals, which is absolutely right and reassuring. Does he agree that it is also vital that this bill is not seen to interfere in any way with British government policy to do with illegal activity by Israeli settlers in the OPT, or indeed the sanctions that this government has already applied against some of them?
And I'm grateful for the question. I think the Secretary of State has answered that question in the affirmative. And it won't change the UK's approach to the Middle East peace process, and nor should it, or its position on settlements. Whichever government will happen to be in power, it is only right that this House and the executive of this country make those sorts of decisions. It will, however, strengthen the government's diplomatic hand by rightfully returning the powers that have gradually been siphoned away by local authorities and third-tier councils and the rest of it, and encourage peaceful coexistence and fulfil our manifesto commitment. So the bill is going to push back against the malevolent anti-Western forces of Hamas. It is those that threaten our way of life and dissolve our security, and it is that movement which has been abetting malicious international forces, by the way, in Tehran and in the Kremlin. And it's for these reasons, Mr. Deputy Speaker, that this House not only has a responsibility, but a fundamental duty to vote for this bill today.
The Secretary of State no later than 6:42, and the division will then take place at 6:45. Claudia Webbe.
Mr. Speaker, in large part, this bill, as we've heard already, is explicitly a reaction to the success of Leicester City Council in defeating legal attempts in 2018 to force it to end its boycott of goods from illegal Israeli settlements until Israel complies with international law and ends its illegal occupation. Arguably, Leicester's stance has been thoroughly vindicated by events of the last few months, in which Israel has launched what South Africa and many UN bodies have called genocidal acts on Gaza, and which has killed hundreds in the West Bank and the occupied Palestinian territories, while protecting Israeli settlers as they beat and even kill Palestinians trying to go about their peaceful lives. While Leicester and other councils have been shown to be doing the right thing, this government has found itself yet again on the wrong side of the issue, backing the oppressor against the oppressed and giving the Israeli regime license to kill tens of thousands. Mr. Speaker, many of my constituency of Leicester East back the Council's actions and bitterly oppose Israel's war crimes against Palestinians and the illegal settlements on whose proliferation has only accelerated. This bill would prevent Leicester and councils like it from carrying out the will of the voters who elected them, tying the hands of the principled and enforcing the will of a government that has shown it prizes geopolitical and economic ends above the lives of tens of thousands of innocent children, women, teachers, doctors, aid workers and journalists. It is a bill designed to hobble democracy and decency. It subjugates local British democracy to the actions and wishes of a foreign occupying power. And it is clearly also intended to circumvent the will of the court, since Leicester comprehensively won its case against those trying to overturn its boycott. The party opposite appear to have little regard for South Africa's forensically compiled case, which invokes the Genocide Convention against Israel at the International Court of Justice. Tomorrow at The Hague, that case will begin to be heard. A boycott, divestment and sanctions campaign lasting almost 3 decades was a vital factor in bringing down South African apartheid. South Africa knows all about the power of such a peaceful but resolute campaign, and it is uniquely well placed to bring a case to the International Court of Justice invoking the Genocide Convention against Israel. Yet, despite only 6 weeks ago, the UK put its signature to Gambia's genocide case at the International Court of Justice against Myanmar, specifically because of Myanmar's treatment of children. Thank you.
David Simmonds.
Well, thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. There's around £70 billion of local government spend in the UK, which is a very significant economic factor. And it is absolutely right that we ensure that in a context where local authorities have the remit within the Social Value Act and the most advantageous tender rules introduced by DULAC, that they are able to make sure that that money is spent in a way that fully expresses their ambitions and the aspirations and views of their local community. But clearly we do need to ensure, and the reason why I support this bill so strongly, that we have appropriate limits where there are risks that that strays into causing real serious division and interfering with what is more appropriately national policy. During my time at the Local Government Association, I spent a good deal of effort working with the local government friends of Israel, looking at the massive amount of lobbying which was done by BDS of local councillors. And I have to pay tribute to our local government counterparts because, overwhelmingly, despite that pressure, they took the view that this was not an appropriate course of action and that in fact they should ensure that it was the concerns and aspirations of their residents that were front and centre, rather than engaging with international campaigns which were both beyond their remit and also at risk of conflicting with the more broadly expressed objectives of the country. And we shouldn't forget, and this is why I think it is particularly important, what the Secretary of State said about the retention of the capacity for freedom of speech, that we do have counterparts in local government who are specifically elected on a local government but international platform. And I think many will recall, for example, the Justice for Kashmir Party, later the PJP, that became a significant force in the politics of Birmingham City Council, specifically elected on an international law issue, later on those members going to join the Liberal Democrat Party, because those communities clearly felt that that was something so important that they were prepared to elect local councillors specifically on that platform. But as a member who represents a very, very diverse constituency, who's heard a lot from people on both sides of this particular debate, I would like to finish, Mr. Deputy Speaker, by saying the thing I find really striking is that the incredibly bitter divisions which have arisen both about this bill and about other issues are not divisions which are seen and felt by my constituents in day-to-day life. When a local Muslim charity wanted to find a base, it found that base in St John's Church. When it wanted to purchase its own permanent base and raise the funds for that, the local synagogue spoke out in support of it. There is a real sense of solidarity amongst our communities, regardless of faith and any other element of diversity in their background. And we need to make sure that this particular movement, BDS, which solely targets the State of Israel, is restricted from inflicting any further damage on our communities.
Indeed, Slaughter.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This is a bad bill, both in intent and in the methods it adopts, which are harmful to Britain's reputation around the world, to human rights, to the proper conduct of state actors and corporations alike, to the freedom of speech of citizens and the actions of public and elected bodies. It has nothing to recommend it. It aims to prevent boycotts, any boycott, where the right of public bodies, especially those which are elected, can consider factors beyond the commercial in procurement investment decisions, can consider ethical factors, which often are also sensibly commercial factors as well. It neuters the exercise of choice by pension funds, employees and citizens. It constricts the freedom of expression of religious groups, of trade unions and elected councillors. It prescribes freedom of speech in a draconian way, which sets a very unfortunate precedent.
Would you on that point?
I will briefly.
Just thank him for giving way very briefly. I mean, just on that particular point about the freedom of speech, does he share concerns that I have, and as do others, that Clause 4 may indeed contradict the government's own freedom of speech bill and the academic freedom enjoyed on university campuses?
Yeah, I don't think it's lost on any member of the House, frankly, that the rhetoric that we've heard from the government in favour of freedom of speech is flatly contradicted by the provisions of this bill in a most, as I say, draconian way. The so-called exceptions require actions to be unlawful before action can be taken, whereas in fact we know how difficult it is, particularly where foreign states are concerned, to have convictions against them in that way. There is no evidence produced by the government, only assertion to support this. This bill fails every test. It weakens human rights protections for persecuted groups around the world, from the Rohingya to the Uyghurs. But it particularly fails Israel and Palestine. It singles out Israel for special treatment. In the words of Daniel Levy, the respected commentator, former Israeli negotiator, talking to MPs earlier in Parliament earlier today, it demands a lower standard of Israel, not a higher standard of Israel. And it conflates, it doesn't distinguish between Israel and the occupied Palestinian territories. And in both those respects, the singling out of Israel and the conflating of Israel with the OPT, it breaks a consensus that both parties have had over successive governments. And finally, Mr. Deputy Speaker, can I just deal with this issue of settlements? It often comes up. It came up in the urgent question earlier this week, raised by myself and by the member for North West Hampshire, as to why, given that at a time when the Foreign Office guidance advises against investment in settlements, when the government rightly has spoken out about settlements being reintroduced into Gaza, when the government has rightly talked about sanctions against violent settlers, at the same time, by the provisions of this bill, it seeks to prevent any action being taken against settlements which are illegal under international law. A ban on settlement goods, on investment in settlements, is not the same in any respect as a boycott, and constantly the government dodges that issue, and it needs to deal with that issue because the signals it sends out are entirely contradiction in that respect. I hope that this bill will be defeated tonight. I'm sure if it is not defeated tonight, or the reason amendment is not carried, that we will return to this in the other place, and that this bill will not see the light of day before a general election. It certainly shouldn't. It will be a shameful legacy, even for this government.
Nicola Richards.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I thank my right honourable friend for bringing this bill forward, a landmark piece of legislation for which the government should be applauded and taken such strong action. This bill's intention to promote community cohesion should be endorsed by all members across the House, especially at a time where anti-Semitism here in the UK has sharply risen. Since the 7th of October, the day which saw the largest number of deaths of Jewish people since the Holocaust, a horrendous massacre committed by a terrorist group, Hamas, Jews worldwide have suffered from anti-Jewish hatred in response to that slaughter. Before Israel had even responded, before Israel and its allies could even fathom the full extent of the utter horror sown by Hamas, demonstrators filled the streets of London celebrating Hamas's attack. Flags flown in solidarity with our ally Israel were vandalised. In 2 months, from the 7th of October to the 13th of December, the CST recorded 2,098 anti-Semitic incidents here in the UK, dwarfing the 800 incidents recorded in the first 9 months of 2023. Jewish businesses have been targeted, as well as businesses with any small connection to Jewish owners or the Jewish state. Social media is rife with long lists of companies to boycott just because the BDS movement does not like the people who run them. Intimidating protests have taken place outside the likes of Zara and McDonald's. Young children have been taunted after enjoying their Happy Meal at the fast food chain. In one incident, rodents were released into a McDonald's chain in Birmingham, next door to my constituency. Jewish students have been boycotted with university societies and Sunday league football clubs, refusing to play against Jewish players and societies. BDS not only targets businesses but people. It's appalling that publicly funded bodies would give succour to such division and extremism. Yesterday I held a Westminster Hall debate on increases in anti-Semitic offences, where I was pleased to hear the commitment by colleagues to stamp out anti-Jewish hatred on the streets of the UK. The commitment to reduce anti-Semitism is helped here today by voting in favour of this bill. The BDS movement is anti-Semitic. The movement is against peace and against normalisation. It calls for the eradication of Israel, the world's only Jewish state. The Anti-Defamation League reports that the BDS campaigns frequently include anti-Semitic tropes of Jewish power and dual loyalty, as well as accusing the Jewish people and Israel as culpable for crises across the globe. BDS activity advanced by public bodies has legitimised and driven anti-Semitism in the UK, exclusively targeting Israel, singling out Jewish people in the UK. It has created divisions which our society needs to be repaired. This is our opportunity to reassure the Jewish community and show them our support. BDS unfairly targets Jewish businesses and people, as well as Palestinians who work for Israeli companies, and I've spoken about this before. At a time where we strive for peace in the Middle East, BDS inflames tensions and rejects coexistence. I stand in full support of this bill today and the Jewish community here in the UK as well as abroad.
Alison Thewlis.
Thank you very much, Mr Deputy Speaker. I'm opposed to this anti-boycott bill on several points. It's difficult to see the timing of this bill as anything other than a cynical move from the UK government. The Secretary of State talks about support for community cohesion and a peaceful two-state solution, but this legislation does nothing to achieve either. Instead, it will seriously curtail all our civil liberties and undermine devolution. And if the volume of correspondence I've received in this bill is any indication, the people of Glasgow are as ever seeing right through the Tories. The Honourable Member for Glasgow South West mentioned the granting of the freedom of the city of Glasgow to Nelson Mandela. In 1986, Glasgow District Council renamed St George's Place Nelson Mandela Place as a mark of the city's solidarity with Nelson Mandela, who was still imprisoned at the time. The point of this was that the South African consulate was located on this street, and they were then forced to use an address bearing the name of their most high-profile political prisoner. This act of international resistance would simply not have been possible if this legislation had been in place in 1986. And at that time, the UK government was still refusing to condemn apartheid. So who would want to speak with one voice when that is what the voice of the UK government is saying on Scotland's behalf? Indeed, such discussion of an act would even have been unlikely to take place under Clause 4's gagging effect. According to Liberty, in practice, a public body seeking to comply with the bill is likely to take steps to distance itself from anything related which suggests it holds any political or moral views as to the conduct of foreign states, for fear it can be found to be in breach of the ban or related prohibition on statements. And this legislation will undoubtedly alter the executive competence of Scottish ministers and should be opposed by all of those who value devolution. The provisions contained in this bill are disproportionate and frankly unnecessary. The bill hands sweeping powers to the Secretary of State and the Treasury to request information from the devolved administrations to assess whether a breach of the boycott ban or the gagging clause has even occurred, and the powers to impose a compliance notice. This is a huge overstep. There are already significant protections in Scottish procurement legislation for bidders from countries where a relevant trade agreement already exists. It is really not clear what problem the UK government is trying to fix here. And worse still, the bill makes it unlawful for Scottish ministers to even publish a statement stating that they would have acted in a certain way if not curtailed by these measures. The legislative consent motion published by the Deputy First Minister describes this as an assault on democratic expression. And as we head into an election year, the Prime Minister is affirming the legacy he and his predecessors will leave behind will be one of a democracy in tatters, faith in public institutions annihilated, and our hard-won rights stripped bare. It is increasingly the case, Mr Deputy Speaker, that the only hope left for the people of Scotland to protect our democratic freedoms is the hope of an independent Scotland.
To the 642, Miriam Cates.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker, and I do support this legislation, but I find it very sad that we need it. When I first heard about the Holocaust as a school child, I was shocked. Shocked at the scale of the evil, the horror of what happened to the Jews, shocked that it could have been allowed to happen. As an adult, I visited Yad Vashem and Auschwitz, and the forests in Poland where thousands upon thousands of Jews, including children, were murdered in cold blood by Nazi soldiers because they were Jews. No one walks away from those sites in any doubt about the potential consequences of anti-Semitism. But one thing I was sure of before October the 7th is that it would never happen again. Surely the world, this country at least, is alive to the consequences of anti-Jewish attitudes, to the importance of not tolerating anti-Semitism, of the need for Israel, an Israel that has the same right to exist and to defend itself as any other sovereign nation. But now I'm not so convinced that we have learned the lessons of anti-Semitism. Polling shows shocking levels of support for Hamas amongst young people here and in the States. This is being driven by social media, but it is also being fostered by...
With leave of the House, Secretary of State.
Thank you very much, Mr Deputy Speaker, and I'd like to thank everyone who spoke in this third reading debate, and of course the member for Penistone and Stockbridge, who was articulating what I feel, the vital importance of recognising where anti-Semitism begins and where it ends. But I also want to thank those speakers who spoke powerfully from a personal point of view, the Member of Parliament for Chipping Barnet, who's only recently returned from Israel, of which she has been such a strong friend and supporter, but of course the Member of Parliament for Oxford West and Abingdon, and our heart goes out not just to her family, but to all those who are suffering in Gaza at the moment. I wanted briefly to address one point which I think is a misconception, which is that this bill acts as an effective restraint, a gagging clause on free speech. The member for Hammersmith talked of faith groups being silenced and so on. As the explanatory votes make clear, individuals are in no way prohibited from expressing their view, however disagreeable we might find it, on the conflict in Israel and Gaza, or indeed expressing a view which I would abhor, that the State of Israel should not exist. What is clear is that only public authorities, not individuals, are governed by this bill. So when the member for Warwick and Leamington quite rightly drew attention to the importance of freedom of speech, not least on campus, not least with academic freedom at its heart, I can reassure him, and he can be reassured, that whatever other misgivings he has about this bill, it is not a direct assault on the principle of free speech. It is simply, clearly and tightly drawn in order to ensure that public bodies, public authorities, cannot abuse the position that has been vested in them as corporate bodies to more broadly undermine the foreign policy of the United Kingdom, or particularly in this case, as has been pointed out by a number of honourable members, and indeed by the opposition front bench, to give succour to an explicitly anti-Semitic campaign. And again, I would stress there will be different opinions across this House about the best way of securing Israel and the best way of securing freedom for the Palestinians. And the fact that debates are so intense in this House reflects the care and the passion that so many members bring to that debate. But this bill is explicitly about making sure that citizens in the United Kingdom who have been targeted by an explicitly anti-Semitic campaign get the protection for which the organisations that stand up for them have been asking. And it's in that spirit, in the spirit of the Community Security Trust, the Board of Deputy of British Jews and the Jewish Leadership Council, that I hope that as many members as possible, I've only seconds left, that as many members as possible will feel that they can support this legislation.
Order. Under the terms of the Order of the House of the 25th of October 2023, I must now put the questions necessary to bring proceedings on third reading to a conclusion. We're going to do the amendment first. The original question was that the bill be now read a third time, since when an amendment has been proposed as on the order paper. The question is that the amendment be made. As may I say aye? Aye. Of the contrary, no. No. Clear the lobbies. So it's 10 minutes for this division and then 8 minutes should there be a division on third reading. The original question was that the bill be now read a third time, since when an amendment has been proposed as on the order paper. The question is the amendment be made. If not, say aye. Aye. Contrary, no. No. Tell us of the ayes, Mary Glindon, Andrew Weston. Tell us of the no, Suzanne Webb, Mike Wood.
The ayes to the right, 228. The noes to the left, 284.
The ayes to the right, 228. The noes to the left, 284. So the noes have it. The noes have it. And look. The question is that the bill be now read a third time. As many of that opinion say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. No! Division. Clear the lobby. Order. The question is that the bill be now read a third time. As many of that opinion say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. Tell us for the ayes, Suzanne Webb, Mike Wood. Tell us for the noes, Andrew Weston, Mary Glindon. Order, order.
The ayes to the right, 282. The noes to the left, 235.
Thank you. The ayes to the right, 282. The noes to the left, 235. So the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Unlock. We now come to motion number 5 on electronic communications.
I beg to move.
Question is as on the order papers. May I say aye?
Aye.
Contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. We come to motion number 6 on terms and conditions of employment.
I beg to move.
Question is as on the order papers. May I say aye?
Aye.
Contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it.
I beg to move that this House do now adjourn.
The question is that this House do now adjourn.